Good evening, everyone. We welcome all participants to the iIndia webinar on analytics and AI. Our moderator for today is Mr. Jairam, and our speaker is Mr. Deepjee Singhal and Mr. Jeffrey, who will be introduced in more details by Mr. Jairam. The duration of the webinar is from 6 to 8 p.m. We hope you enjoy participating in the webinar and request you to please take out a few minutes at the end to provide us with your valued feedback. I will now hand over to Mr. Jairam.
Thank you, Mr. Chanchal. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the IA India Bombay chapter webinar on analytics and AI. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the webinar this evening, Mr. Jeffery Sorensen and Mr. Deepjee Singhal. I would like to introduce Mr. Jeffery Sorensen first. Mr. Sorensen is the industry strategist at Caseware Analytics Canada. He joined Caseware in August 2016 as the product manager for their flagship analytics product Idea and is now serving as an industry strategist. He is a certified instructor with 10 years of international consulting experience in Caseware Idea for a variety of industries, including insurance, banking, utilities, government, and online services. Jeff has over 20 years of experience in information technology, holding positions within IT systems development, IT security, IT auditing, project management, and as an IT consultant. Jeff has also implemented continuous auditing, monitoring, and governance risk and compliance solutions for clients in the public and private sector. So I would like to welcome Mr. Jeffery Sorensen to the webinar this evening. I would also like to introduce Mr. Deepjee Singhal, who would be our second speaker this evening. Mr. Singhal is a partner at Pipalia Singhal and Associates and an advisor to SAMA Audit Systems and Software Private Limited. He has been involved in setting up risk management mechanisms, internal audit services, and business consultancy on design, documentation, and implementation of systems and procedures. He has undergone training at the Drucker Institute, Claremont Graduate University, USA, and is an accredited trainer for the Drucker Curriculum Management Program. He was the World President, Leadership Council of the Peter Drucker Society for year 2011 and past President of the Institute of Internal Auditors India Bombay chapter. He has also co-authored two books, Internal Audit Assurance, Governance, Risk and Control, A Complete Guide to Internal Audit, and Best Practices by Leading Chief Audit Executives, Making a Difference, both published by CCH, a Walter Kluwer's business. Good evening all, and enjoy the webinar. Thank you, esteemed speakers. And Jeff, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jairam, and nice introduction. And I'd want to just thank Sama Audit and Deepjee and his whole team for bringing me into the IA India to make this presentation. So thank you all. Hope you're having a good evening. So we're going to talk a bit about analytics and AI. So let's get started here. All right. So there's a lot of talk about analytics, about artificial intelligence, and is it the same? Is one replacing the other? There's a lot of disinformation out there. There's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about this technology. And we're going to try to show you a bit about sort of what it's capable of and what it's not capable of, and how we see these trends impacting audit, and also what you can do about it. So we can see basically, we're going to define what we really mean by artificial intelligence. We're going to look at the global developments that are going on out there. And we actually do have a couple of videos. The thing is, you can talk about AI all you want, but until you see what companies are doing, I find it doesn't really register. To talk about it theoretically is one thing, but to actually see how a factory is changing or doing a particular operation, it's eye-opening. So hopefully it'll be eye-opening for you too. Then the audit perspective. What is audit looking for in analytics and intelligence? How do we see it? And we're looking at practical examples. So we're going to find out particular audit apps, intelligence that you can use right now in your audits. And you can work with Sama Audit to get you set up, at the end of this call. Really, I mean, it's a lot of this stuff is out there now, and that you can take advantage of. And I recommend that you do. And number 5 here is how you can get started, of course. All right, so let's start. The first point is about defining what artificial intelligence really is. You would think it'd be an easy way to define it, but unfortunately, there are many definitions of artificial intelligence out there. The big challenge is that it's the word intelligence that makes it tricky. because we don't really have a very good definition of intelligence. But basically, this is what they mean when they talk about artificial intelligence, is automating the activity associated with human thinking, as in able to make decisions, to be able to solve problems, and to learn from its mistakes and its successes. That's really what we're talking about when it comes to artificial intelligence. And as you can see when we go through this, not all solutions check all the boxes very well. Some do all, some do a couple. But it's basically about creating machines to do things people are traditionally better at. Because machines have a lot of advantages over people in terms of, if it's a very monotonous, a very particular task and you're looking for a needle in a haystack, computers are very good at that, right? So that makes sense that we would augment our skills with that kind of capability. So a definition we've seen is AI is the branch of computer science concerned with the automation of intelligent behavior. Intelligence is the computational ability to achieve goals in the world. Very high level, but I think it sort of fits. All right, there's a lot on this slide, and it's just more convenient to have it all in one slide. I know it's really hard to read. But if you look at the common terms for artificial intelligence and the common concepts out there, machine learning, people talk about a lot. And I think there's a lot of promise in machine learning in particular. It's a subset of artificial intelligence, and machine learning algorithms basically build a mathematical model based on data, sample data, they call that training data, in order to make predictions or decisions without being explicitly programmed to do so. So in the old days, you had some logic that says, if this, then go here, if not, then go somewhere else. That's not how machine learning works. Machine learning looks at its own data and starts making up those paths and says, well, if I see this happen, then I'm likely to see this and this because the data told me so. So it's a different way of programming, and it also makes it more unpredictable because we're not hard coding all the paths. We don't really know what we're going to get until we see the data. And the data is different every time, and the paths could be different every time. So it's good and it's bad in that respect. So within machine learning, there are really two flavors of it. There's what they called unsupervised machine learning, which is where the computer will process all the information without any human feedback. So basically, it does its own thing, it draws its own conclusions, it categorizes things accordingly. We don't get involved. People really want this to be successful because supervised machine learning is where the computer will try its best, and then people will look at the results, and then they will manually look at it and say, is this correct? Did it get it right or wrong? Right? Okay, good. We'll say correct. Did you get this one? No, it didn't. Wrong. So that one's wrong. And we flag it as such, and then the computer uses that flagging for the next time it sees similar data. Is going to go, I think this is it. Wait a minute. They said it's not. Okay, I will do something different. So it's about using, but you could see the challenge of supervised machine learning is going to be that how many people do you have? How much time do you have to sit and manually correct everything? In fact, if you've seen, ever been online when you see these check all boats in the images, they have this grid of pictures, check all boxes that contain a boat or whatever. That's supervised machine learning, really, right? Computers is giving you, some ideas, and we have to correct. Now, it's different in the sense that it's meant as a quiz so that we can discourage automated bots from knowing. But it's that concept that it produces something and then human beings have to check and verify it. Right. So now there's another branch of artificial intelligence which is really gaining a lot of steam. And this is also something you can work with today, by the way. It's called natural language processing, NLP. And it's pretty fascinating. What they've done is they've basically taken the core aspects of machine learning, so a lot of math, and then they have fed the machine language. They just feed it books and books and books and articles. And from all that material, the computer systems learn a language. So they'll figure out what words go with which words, when you say these things, this tends to come next. If you look at a lot of when you're typing on your phone now, you will see that it will recommend the next word, right? It'll say this, and if you say this, the next word is going to be probably this. So it puts it in gray, and more often than not, it's correct. right? That's just based on experience. It's been fed a lot of information, and then it can guess what the next word is. So what is happening is this NLP is about how computers have now learned languages, the grammar rules. It's linguistics, it's computer science, it's artificial intelligence from a language perspective. So in the beginning, they did things like semantics. So they would say, what is the meaning of a word in context? You know, what if, especially if words have similar sounds, what does a word mean in this particular context? And they can figure that out. Machine translation, we've seen Google Translate, right? It's doing a much better job now than it did in the beginning. Not perfect though, but it's getting much better, I find. Name entity recognition. So for instance, if you put in a phrase, it'll recognize which of them are names of places and people in the list. So that way, let's say you have 100 documents and you say, give me all the people in these documents, it will pull out all the names, right? So that can be very handy for fraud investigations. You might want to see if a particular lawyer keeps appearing in all these documents, and it'll show, yep, this individual keeps showing up with all these cases. So, you know, it's very useful. Natural language generation, that is going to be a big thing. It is where NLP will actually write an essay, or it'll actually write a paragraph from scratch. So in other words, it doesn't have, it's not just copying the source. You somehow give the computer the instruction what you want to achieve, and it will write a paragraph. You've seen sometimes, if you've seen computers are writing poetry or pickup lines, there's a lot of people, there are a lot of jokes about this where the computer is trying to be creative and it writes some very strange things right now. Maybe in a future session, I'll try to bring some quotes in for them. They're really funny. But yes, the computers are starting to be able to write things from scratch. So if you say, an example of this is there's a lot of reporting in the US, but I think everywhere it's happening, where you can't really afford to have a journalist working on, for instance, the score of kids playing baseball. Little League is what they call it, baseball. What happened in each inning, like who scored how many runs, and what they want is to write up a small story about the thrilling game. Well, they're not, real journalists are not going to be doing that because it's just for kids and their parents. But AIs are starting to do it now, where they will say it was a sunny day and whatever, and then the first half, these people scored the following runs, then bad luck happened, this happened, whatever, and they'll write the story about what happened based on a table of scores. So you can see where this is going. This is quite interesting. Natural language understanding is where we are, again, trying to determine the meaning of text. So you give it something, what does it actually mean? And the computer will be able to determine what it actually represents. So you can ask it questions, and this is the next one, question answering. You can give it a human language question, and it will be able to give you a sensible answer back. And we can see a little bit of this with Siri and so forth, but you know, this is definitely going to evolve. Sentiment analysis, you're going to see a lot of that, is where we look at sentences and we determine how positive or negative is the sentiment, or is it fairly neutral, or is it very inflammatory language? And this is very useful for things like product reviews. You can have a computer scan the internet for everyone leaving a comment about your product or company and see what they say. Are they thumbs up? Are they thumbs down? Sometimes we have those. Sometimes people just use, we can analyze the language and determine if they're being negative or positive about your company. And of course, automatic summarization. You can create a human readable summary of a large body of text. So if you have a document and you say, computer, just give me one paragraph, what's this about? Then it should be able to distill a full document and write out a small summary for you. So you can see the technology has a lot of promise, certainly. And then finally, a couple more things I want to talk about network or the methods they perform this. What's starting to happen is we realize that the human brain is we don't fully understand, but it's also very powerful in its ability to learn and draw connections. So neural network is where we're really essentially trying to mimic the human brain by creating a circuit of neurons And basically they have states between negative to positive, which represent desirable and undesirable paths. So over time, when we say this is what we wanted, that gets a +1. We found something that failed, we give that a -1. But these networks become enormous, and they become multi-layered. And again, it is kind of how the human brain works, and we're starting to see some real promise in this field. And deep learning is really using artificial neural networks. And again, they can be supervised, semi-supervised, or unsupervised where they learn. But as you can see, deep learning has been used for lots of things: speech recognition, image recognition, and restoration. I think that's kind of interesting. Natural language processing, we just talked about that. Discovering new drugs, medical image analysis, and of course, there are many, many things that deep learning is starting to get good at. And there are lots of these learning frameworks out there that are open and you can use anytime you want. All right. So basically, if you look at all this, you can see we've sort of these concentric rings. We've got AI, pretty broad term, machine learning, subset of that. Deep learning is a subset within that. And again, deep learning would be able to train itself to perform tasks as well. Okay, this all sounds good. We all think this has lots of promise. Maybe some of you are a little scared about it, but we have a lot of challenges still. This is not some sort of fait accompli that this is completely solved. One of the big challenges is, what if the training data is poor? And we're starting to see that. Articles are coming out now. Here's a couple. One out of MIT here, out of a technology review. They're saying that a lot of the data sets we're using for training are actually very poor. And they're talking a bit about how you can tell that the training data is poor, that you would be able to take the training data and be able to feed it through the machine and compare it to results and see that it's not finding the matches that it's supposed to, or that the training data was actually itself wrong. And this is really a problem because the whole foundation of all this is data, right? So far, the way we're building AI requires a lot of training, or it has no idea. The computer doesn't know what it is. And you can see others, they talk about the big data problem. And a lot of people right now are involved in trying to correct, this bad data. But it's a real problem. So if we don't have good training data, we don't get good results. The world is biased, so our data is also biased. So there's an example out of, I think it was California. Apple, they introduced a credit card, this titanium credit card. And there was a husband and wife who were both technologists. They work for some tech firm. They were in a similar position. I think the salaries were very close. And they both applied for credit. And he got double the credit that she did. Now, why? Probably because in the past, women probably got less credit. So it looks in the history and says, what do I give a woman of this age working in this company in credit? They typically get less. I'm going to give them the average, right? Men ask for higher credit, they get more, right? And the computer thinks it's doing the right thing, but we have to look at this data and say, how do we audit this data? How do we know that this data is really representative of not just the past, but actually where we want to go, where we need to be? So there are huge minefields in this space. This whole field needs to be audited, absolutely, because we're building machines that are based on invalid assumptions. So AI is very good at deep, narrow applications, but not with wide ones. So in other words, if you build a computer system to look for a particular pattern in a particular type of image, it can be very successful. But if you tell the computer to figure out whether this is a dog or a cat, it's a little bit more confused or if you wanted to do simple basic things in the physical world, that still remains very, very challenging for a computer or for robotics, because again, general intelligence is much more complicated than we think it is. Narrow intelligence can be built fairly quickly, as far as language translation, as an example. You focus on languages and how they work, you will eventually get it right, and we're getting pretty good at it. But wide general intelligence is still quite far from where we are today. Again, the physical world remains a challenge. You're going to see a video saying they're starting to narrow that gap, but it's still very challenging for computers and, well, robotics, and dealing with unpredictable human behavior. I mean, that's the thing about, let's look at self-driving cars, right? Self-driving cars, if everything was perfect in the real world, they would be everywhere. But the problem is there's road work, there's construction, parts of the road are closed, and the street lines are pointing into a wall, and someone's pointing, hey, go this way. Well, what does a car do? Does it have to listen to the language and figure out what you're saying? How does it know what the right action is? And we don't have a lot of technology. They say 5G can help by putting 5G all over the road to help guide cars correctly. But in the human behavior in the real world is a big challenge. All right, so let's look at the global developments that are happening around computers. Obviously, a lot of excitement about it. I mean, already since the 50s, people have been thinking and looking at artificial intelligence. We discovered machine learning sort of from the 80s onwards. I didn't realize it was that old, but there it is. And deep learning sort of within the 2010s started happening, and that we started really seeing big enhancements once deep learning came into being. Again, I'm going to show you a video, or the IA, India is going to show you a video in a minute. But basically, every single field is trying to take advantage of these new innovations. And I think there's a good reason why. They definitely want to investigate it, examine it to see if it can help them. But basically, fraud detection everywhere, marketing, sales is going to be huge. A lot of finance, credit decisions, risk management. There's for trading platforms. Insurance could really use it for their claims and underwriting. Healthcare, enormous in terms of AI microscopes and discovering new drugs, discovering new materials. Of course, we're talking about self-driving cars. Maintenance prediction. There's retail, there's stores, and I'll show that in another presentation. But Amazon isn't the only store or company building stores with basically no people. So the idea is that you would use your app to get into the store, and you just help yourself to things, and you just leave, and you get billed automatically. So I saw there's a Swedish company also doing this up in the Arctic or up north, small towns where they don't can't pay to have a lot of staff, but they have these sort of self-serve stores. So interesting. Airlines, of course. Cybersecurity, absolutely huge in recognizing facial recognition for security purposes, and so forth. It goes on and on and on. Restaurants, of course, there's more work coming in the restaurant business. But what I really want to do is I want to really turn over to the IA India, and there's the video I want to show you, because when you see a video, it becomes really clear rather than just talking about it. So let's watch a video. It's about 6 minutes, but it'll go by fast. All right. Am I back on?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Jeff.
Okay, good. So if I switch my slide, you can see I've changed the slide now?
Yeah.
Not yet.
Mr.
Not yet. Okay.
Jairam sir, you can make Jeff sir as a presenter.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. Do we want to? No, show my screen.
And
There we
you
go.
Jeff,
can
I
mute
made you
me.
the present.
Okay. All right. Do you see me now? Oh, you see, I guess the deck here. It says
Yes,
global projections.
yes,
Excellent. Good.
yes.
Let me keep going. All right. So anyway, so your thoughts. If you have thoughts about what you saw, put it in the chat. I'd like to see what your thoughts were. Was there any particular thing that you noticed? Some things did surprise me, and also I think hopefully you get an appreciation for some of the AI concepts and automation concepts were pretty solid, very very sound. Others were not so sound. Others seemed to me a little frivolous or not sure how they're getting the business benefit. And I would say this is the reason I really kind of want to show that is that not AI is not always a good fit for your company. You know, sometimes people automate things too quickly and without really proving it. So be aware of that in your organization when that happens. As you can see, industries, I mean, many industries are playing with this. Now, what you did see in the video, they are actually real. Even that delivery robot, the one that walked up the grass to deliver a box, they have a whole series of these robots, and they are actually real. They do have them. I'm not sure they're used very often. They're still very much being tested, but they have all kinds of different models of those robots that are designed to do certain tasks. So yes, they are real. They're not fully used by everyone. But even that, you saw that construction robot, the big heavy black one that was lifting up drywall. Clearly, you know, it's still being worked on. But there are companies that are leasing them. They are paying money to have those and try them out and see what they can do. So it's the very beginning of this stage. But I really want to show this now because you're going to see this much more as the years go by. All right. So basically, what are the drivers? Why are they doing this? Well, one is they're looking for higher productivity, right? If they can. How can they get more work, faster work out of people? How do they get more consistent, higher quality work? We saw with the pizza example where they're trying to bake the pizza en route to the customer so it's fresher, so they don't get a cold pizza, and also so they could centralize most of the work and they don't have as many kitchens. Because I do think with real estate and the prices that real estate is reaching, there are companies that will no longer be able to afford rental, but they could have a truck. They could probably operate from a vehicle, and that would be much cheaper for them. So it's very interesting to see where this is going. Also, seeing what humans cannot. Now you did see it on those apples. You saw the fruit picking with the apples and whatnot. That they can have sensors that scan through the fruit to see if it's ripe, right? And excuse me, it's not just colors. They could also use colors. But having these special sensors, I've seen it with a restaurant was checking to see when hamburgers are cooked. They had scanners that could check the internal temperature of the beef, right, or whatever they're cooking, right. So there's also sensors that and to see things that humans cannot, predicting what humans cannot. Sometimes with too much data, we don't really see the relevant trends, whereas computer programs designed to do a particular thing will be able to predict patterns that we cannot. Things like you've heard of CAT scans, where they feed millions of CAT scans into a computer, and it is more successful at finding early stages of cancer than humans looking at the chart can. So those are all good examples of where we can really use this. And of course, labor augmentation. So it is where we need to have more, we need more bodies doing work, but we can't hire more people. So we need to add more additional tech to get more throughput, but keep our costs low. Let's look at it from the audit perspective now. All right. So remember, we just saw this slide here. You may say all these things are all great. And all those examples that I showed in the video, none of them were audit, right? They were things like the therapist, Ellie, the virtual therapist, pizza, and stuff like that. And they're not necessarily audit, right? So how does this relate to audit? Well, if you look at the concepts we just talked about, I think they do relate to audit. We are talking about, how do we get more work with the same crew, and some techniques and robotics process automation, RPA, and automation in general are definitely going to be ways that audit could leverage this. How do they break up the work, automate parts, and let the human beings focus on more of the critical analysis, but get the computers to prepare the data, get in the right condition, automate the rote tasks. That's always the goal. More consistent, higher quality work. I would say if you want consistency, definitely things like audit apps can really help, and we'll talk about what those are. But they are basically testing frameworks that can work on any source data that are built to be very consistent, but still customizable. So in other words, you want to test for purchasing. Purchasing, there's a certain number of tests that you're always going to perform with purchasing. You might have to tweak the limits when you run, small company versus a large company, but these tests are mostly the same. Well, you're going to get more consistent, higher quality work if you can subject them to an audit app, because it can run through it in much faster time, and then it can let you focus on the things that are not so clear, or things where you really need a human being to study it. Seeing what humans cannot, what you're going to see are things like triggers. I don't get into a lot of it in this presentation, but triggers are basically alerts where information is going through the transaction system, and there's certain conditions you want to look out for. So you put in some alerts in the main enterprise source application to look for certain patterns, and when it sees them, to notify you and bring data down from the core system to say, this trend is going more in the opposite direction than it should. You should have a look, and then you will focus on it. So you can't be everywhere at once. It's kind of like if you invest in the stock market, you can set these triggers. You can set these alerts on your stock. So if the stock is going up a lot, you can put a trigger so you don't miss the opportunity, right? So it's the same with business triggers. Machine learning, of course, will be able to see things we cannot. And natural language processing, you can scan through thousands of documents and find certain phrases or certain tendencies in language that you would not be able to do in that short amount of time. Predicting what humans cannot, again, AI and statistical methods. Statistics is really the underpinning of all AI, and we can use linear regression, we can use other forms of prediction as part of the math. Cost savings, of course, we talked about that already. Okay, so let's start with RPA, figure out what it is, who does it, how can it help, and sometimes how can it not? Not just to jump in and automate everything and think everything is going to be perfect. There are horror stories as well, where companies have automated too much and they're failures and they lose money. They have to correct mistakes and bring people back. So you want to do this intelligently, for sure. And we're going to talk a bit about audit apps, basically how you can follow risk-based audit methodology, and you can reuse them on any data source, and you can automate the process from start to finish. And of course, machine learning and deep learning, we've talked about the things you can, from an audit perspective, we could use statistical methods. Outlier analysis is very useful. Continuous monitoring would be possible using machine learning and deep learning. And of course, we can learn from big data. All right, so let's talk about RPA first. So the goal of RPA is really, we want to use software to automate knowledge workers' tasks that are repetitive and time consuming. And this is really important here. A computer cannot be given responsibility, right? They can't be responsible for an audit. So there are whole sections of audit that will always be people, and people will always be running. So this is not about that at all. This is about things where the process of getting the data, transforming it, bring it into a state where it can be analyzed is very routine, but doesn't add any value. is where this process, you will get no value if you don't do it, but it's very time consuming to do it. So it's just kind of wasted calories you're spending bringing or taming this data in a way that you can actually analyze. So the goal of RPA is really to find those tasks in your work and find ways where the machines can do this kind of work, provided that it's repetitive and provided that it's time consuming enough that it's worth it, right? So the features are, you want to use existing systems. You're automating the automation, if that makes sense. When we say can mimic human behavior, at a very basic, very crude level, it's non-invasive. So basically, you're kind of keeping the systems you have, and you're working with what you've got, and you're adding this layer on, this engine, which will sit on top of whatever you have and use it. So it will open this application. It will print it to a select PDF. It will output the PDF. Another thing will import that PDF. So it's not, you're not rewriting all your systems. It's just sort of sitting on top of your system. And if you look at finance and accounting, there are many organizations who really rely on a lot of manual processes. They talk about a third of financial services organizations. They have a lot of manual processes. And almost half of accounts payable professionals consider manual data entry their biggest challenge. They just have way too much of that for their work. So appropriate tasks, what is good for RPA? Again, many things are not appropriate for RPA, but if you can define what this is, if it's pretty standard, it's based on rules that are very defined and clear, they have to be repetitive. You have to do this every month, every week, every day, and the inputs need to be machine readable. So if you check all these boxes, you may have a candidate for RPA. So again, if you look at this whole continuum here, there's a portion, if you start right from the leftmost part of the chart here, is if things are happening a lot, there's a high, what they call case frequency, you could automate the entire process, meaning you would change how the system works and you would write it in a different way. And again, it depends on how often, if it happens all the time, if it's every hour, every day, you probably want to rewrite the whole process and gain that efficiency, right? But let's say that's not possible. You'd say it runs every month. It's not really worth it then to change the whole process for that. And then way at the other end, you have work that really only human beings can do realistically. They're infrequent cases. They require a lot of judgment. They require a lot of finesse that only the human mind would do. So these are out of the question. The left one's out of the question. And then we have this sort of mushy middle here, which is potential candidates, what you might want to use RPA to do it. It's repetitive, but not so frequent that you're going to just scrap the whole thing, and so forth. So that's kind of the zone of items that are potentials. What kinds of things do people do? Well, open, read, and create emails. Log into an app, enterprise app, move files and folders, copy them. You want to copy and paste, fill in forms, read and write to databases, follow decision rules, collect statistics, extract data from documents, make calculations, obtain human input via emails and workflow, pull data from the internet, and enter keystrokes. Just give me 1 second. It's going to. Okay, go right here. So you can see they can do a number of things, but they're not really intelligent, these things. And as I mentioned, RPA really sits on top of existing systems, and they can help sort of puppet master, control other systems to get certain output. That's really what it is. Example, here's an accounts payable process. They receive invoices, they extract customer data out of them, they bring them into Excel, they paste it into QuickBooks, and that customer data, they do a check run and they cut checks for the vendor, right? So it's this kind of thing that you could see it do as an example. All right, so that's RPA. So good, there's some who will definitely use it for certain parts, depending on how repetitive your business is. It could be helpful. That's one possible tool. Another are audit apps. And audit apps are really not like RPA because they are really built for a particular business process. So they are designed for if it's accounts payable, if you're looking at procurement, if you're looking at travel expenditures, if you're looking at inventory, it doesn't really matter, but it's designed around a business process. It's a complete end-to-end audit. So it involves bringing the data out of the source system, transforming it into a standard format, executing tests designed for that particular process to be used on source data. And even if the system should change, the tests themselves will be the same. The transformation will be slightly different. And of course, they'll execute all the audit data analytics tests. They will identify any exceptions that appear, and they will generate an audit report that brings in the audit objectives. They will look at the exceptions that occurred. They will provide tables of evidence that will have links right into the data analytics tool so that you can actually see the source for yourself, and you can show it to the client and you can explore the data together. And again, there can be visualizations in these as well if you want to look at dashboards and all this sort of thing. So you can see they go much further than our RPA and really further than typical scripts do. They are reusable. They can be used on any number of systems, and they're designed with a business process in mind, a particular one. And we're going to show an example of that. There's a short video of that we're going to show later. So now another from the audit perspective saying, how do we add machine learning and deep learning to audit if we want to? What can we do? And again, what we typically see, if you look on these 4 boxes, the 2 boxes on the left say traditional, typical computer-assisted audit techniques and audit tools are you code the rules that you have into scripts. You have standard fraud analytics. You might have some statistical methods like Benford's Law and so forth. You do sampling, and they are really based on some hard rules that you know in the system. So you know purchases over 10,000 must be approved. Okay, so you put a check in anything over 10,000 and so forth. So that's a typical audit testing. When you get into machine learning is really where you're starting to use the data to audit itself. So you're looking at entire data populations, you are looking at outliers, and you're looking at what doesn't fit the picture. So it's scanning through all the transactions saying, what are the outliers here? Of all the transactions that are happening, are there any patterns that develop? So that's what you're doing. And of course, what they call ensemble AI is where they're going to try to explain what the computer is doing and why it picked those transactions. Okay, so if you look at it, and again, you see these elements here are really similar to just bringing them all together. We're really talking about risk-based audits that are more data-driven. So again, we need to capture the data, find out where it is. We need to maybe enrich it, maybe add columns, maybe filter some of them out, join them with other data. Then we need to validate that the data is in fact correct. Then we execute, audit the process. Of course, we want to reconcile our data to make sure it's still accurate and consistent. And we want to analyze the data and we want to report on the data. So those are like very high level concepts. So if you could see various technologies sort of overlay each of these stages. All right. So the drivers for using AI in audit specifically is we really need to have a data-driven engagement. So whenever we do audits, they should be around the data, they should be focused on the data to help drive our results, right? We should have AI-infused workflows, meaning that based on what we're finding, we should be able to branch out and dig deeper. We should be able to scan 100% of the population. We should be able to know what normal is by scanning all the transactions, even historic transactions. So we have a much better chance at finding the outliers. And then real-time collaboration, because AI alone is not going to be successful in audit. You need to have an empowered, intelligent auditor to be able to use this. So think of AI as really just a power tool. It is really just something that's going to make the auditor's life way better. Whereas, you know, you saw what Lotus 123 and Excel did for paper spreadsheets, right? This is really just saying we're going to use more of the computer's power to help the auditor. It's more of a power tool for them. And again, I don't want to get into too much detail here, but it's just trying to show, looking at a financial audit as an example, what the framework would really be. We start with the data source, we understand the entity, we look at the GL and subledger transactions, trial balance, we look at the risks, we gather the evidence, we execute additional procedures, we gather the documentation, and we produce reports, and we discuss them with the client. And they're really just saying there are many different players here. We have, of course, analytical components. You've seen bits of AI. Things like blockchain are going to become more important over time. I do know, I think Bank of India, I think, was outlawing cryptocurrency. I think that's what I heard. But blockchain is going to sneak its way in many other ways. People are, it's coming. If you heard of technology, these NFTs, if you've ever heard of them, is where people take something digital and they wrap it in blockchain to make it a unique piece of art, and then they could sell it for millions. It's crazy, but they're using blockchain for all kinds of technologies, not just money. So anyway, okay, so that's at a very high level, sort of what can audit use, what kinds of things can use as RPA, there's apps, there is machine learning, outlier testing, there's NLP, which is this text analysis. So there's lots of things floating around. Audit can take advantage of those things, and you can take advantage of them today. So let's see how we do that in practice. So let's look at an actual case study of robotics process automation. So there was a UK-based insurer. They had a very complex expense analysis process. They had to audit all their taxes. There was corporation tax, which is one kind of tax. They had VAT expense, the value-added tax. They had employee expense, and there were really regulatory compliance issues. You couldn't get around it. There was no talking around it. The work had to be done. The problem was it was scores of manual analyses every month, lots of manual efforts, and very error prone. You're manually copying, entering, sorting, changing. It was just, really error prone, and millions of transactions every month. So they realized an RPA tool is probably what they needed. It was routine. They needed to do it often enough. There was high risk if it went wrong, and it was very labor intensive and manual and error prone. Let's get a tool. So what they ended up choosing, they settled on Caseware IDEA because they could get the audit analytics and the RPA at the same time. So why just get RPA if you can get a rich audit data analytics client at the same time? Get 2 for 1. They run them in a virtual machine, and they have access to their corporate data. So it just sits there on their VM, and they can access their corporate data anytime, 2 in the morning, whenever it's convenient. The jobs are scheduled because IDEA, you could schedule your tasks any way you want. You can access them from anywhere because it's in a VM. It detects changes in data. It imports and transforms the files. It automatically reconciles data. So if there's an outage, maybe one part of the transaction is wrong, it will notify people, send a note, text message, hey, there's something wrong. These are not balancing. They should balance. Come and check, right? They break files out into monthly files that are more convenient to manage, consolidates results when it's all done. And the end result is they have saved weeks worth of effort every month. Huge success story. Another example of an audit app is something called Tax Audit Professional. These are monthly tax audits. Again, government ministry, it was Germany in this example. They were required to do 2 reviews every month, just I guess the volume, whatever, it was a requirement they had to do. They understood the process very well, and it's not something that changed. There were minor variations that could happen, but the overall tests were all the same, but sometimes the limits were set differently. It was a very manual process, and it would take 2 weeks, 2 weeks of solid effort to do one audit. And that is all the people, the management meetings, and doing, you got to create the report. And it was very routine, but it was just in labor. You had to do the work. It wasn't difficult, but it was just a lot of effort all the time, basically, they had to do. So they thought, let's try to automate this. Let's have an audit app do this, not RPA. So what they did is they created a smart analyzer audit app. So you can see the little process here, the little workflow. Start from the top and you work your way down all the way to the bottom, and then you're done. No programming required by the customer. They can map to any data source. So if the customer changes their data source tomorrow, these apps will still run. The first part of the step gets mapped slightly differently, and the rest of it continues. So long-term value. They can handle variations via custom parameters, so they can tweak what is a big limit, what is a small limit, just by the user, by clicking a box and typing in a number. All the tests were created and audit objectives were documented once. So in the app, all the audit objectives are already included. All the risks and controls are already baked in. So when you create a report, it can automatically write the audit report. It can pull in what is the objective of the test, how does the test work, how many records were there, what did we find? All that can be pulled together automatically. And there's an interactive audit report is linked to the IDEA analytics, so they can explore it with the client. So when the client says, what did you find? They can give the user or the client the audit report, and the auditor has a link in the report, and they can click and it takes them right into IDEA, and they can actually show the data in our tool. And they can filter it, and they can take customers' ad hoc requests and show them right in front of them. There's full transparency. Again, they reduced 30 days to 4 days, all meetings included. This is setting up the meeting, running the audit, running the data, vetting it, first draft meeting, final meeting, close the report. So why not? It's a completely routine task. There is no value add here. You just have to do it. And finally, we're going to show you an audit app example, something called Exceptional Exceptions. Some of you may have seen it. It is something that is included with IDEA that you can download. That's part of your subscription. You can map, again, test to any financial system, configure the tests. It's risk-based auditing and sampling. It uses machine learning tests in addition to other audit tests. And you can extend the standard tests here with your own ad hoc analytics. So you can run the CAN tests, get a report, get a dashboard, but you can also add a couple of tests of your own easily because all the data is completely ready to go. So it's a great starting point. And basically, you can see the things that we're doing: mapping, import, validation, AI-based testing, insights, and so forth. And I think now let's show a short video on this one. I think it's 2 or 3 minutes. So I'll turn it over to IA India. All right. So, thoughts? Put your thoughts in the comments if you want. All right. So we've seen a lot. We've seen what's happening in the world on AI. We've seen what happens, what companies are trying to do, robotics, AI. We've seen what, from an audit perspective, what kinds of things we can do right now. We see what audit AI has been done, real cases, and you saw those case studies I just talked about. You've seen audit apps in function, how they work. How do you get started? Well, I think the first thing you need to do is you need to integrate your audit process in your life cycle. So you need to look at all the things you're actually performing right now. You'll need to say how you can really leverage data in them. Many audit shops, and I've been in internal audit for over a decade, as the people have said before. An internal audit, I know when I was in internal audit, there was a tendency sometimes to do the audit in the least amount of effort possible, the way we always used to do it. So, many times, from my perspective, internal audits were performed with conversation with management, look at a report, and then say you're done. And they're not going to cut it anymore for the future. First of all, they don't provide that much value. And second of all, being able to talk to people, it's not really enough. Like, you're not actually going to find anything that way. So your stakeholders are going to increasingly demand more. So you'll need to look at the types of audits and look at how you perform the audits to see whether it still makes sense. You will need to be collaborating with the clients on a single platform. I know we can send emails and it's okay, but it makes it much easier. And again, I didn't show you those systems today, but there are lots of systems out there where when you find an audit finding, you could push a button and it goes to the client. They see the data, they say, I like it, I don't, let's talk, whatever. You click a button and then it becomes a finding that is vetted by the client, rather than, it's something that you need to then set up a meeting and then discuss. By having more of this integrated in the same workflow, it will definitely save a lot of time, because time is what it's all about. Make every audit a data-driven audit. I talked a bit about that earlier, is that too often I think we are tempted to not engage the data because the data is not easy. I agree. Getting the data is going to take people who have a lot of guts to go out there, find the data, make mistakes, figure out what data they require. But these are investments. You really have to look at this as investments into the future. And in the beginning, you're not going to be more productive with audit analytics. You won't. You're going to be less productive, probably because you are now embarking on a new way of doing things that in the future is going to give you big dividends. But in the first time around, you'll have to learn a lot. So this is going to be, you have to bake this in to your numbers, that it will take some time to really have data-driven audits everywhere. Use data analytics throughout all phases of projects. I would say absolutely. Data analytics, the power of analytics allows you to know when to go deep and when to go back, when to step away. If you can really run the analytics on the process, you'll be able to know this is very much normal. These data amounts aren't much. The risk isn't that high. I'm not going to do this audit. I'm going to put it away. I'll have a trigger. I'll monitor the trend, see if the trend gets worse or better. If it doesn't, I will no longer audit this. The system will just give me reports on trends, and I will focus on areas that are less understood, more risk, and do that. So analytics can do that for you. It's not always about giving you more work. It should be about giving you less. Use audit apps where the process is well defined. And audit apps can be built. If your company is in a position where you say, well, we deal in scrap metal, there's no audit app for scrap metal, we can build them, right? Audit apps, as long as you understand the process very well, the data inputs are very well defined, and you know what constitutes a problem, audit apps can be built, right? So think about this for a second, is that, they're designed to run a process. You have to look at your own business and determine, how big a drain on our company is this manual work, this manual process? And how important is this audit? Is it regulatory? You have to do it. It has to be, but you want to do them as cheaply as you possibly can, because it sucks, it drains the company from all available people on work which is basically mandatory, but nobody cares about it in the end. They only care if it's not done, right? So definitely consider audit apps in your arsenal, and augment audits with statistical models and machine learning. I would say really try to find a reason to get into this now. If you're not doing this already, and again, if you talk to Sama Audit, there are audit apps, there are add-ons and plugins you can use today to start to use this. If you want to look at outliers on a large body of transactions and say, I wonder what I find, you can do this today. If you have a big stack of PDF documents you need to get through and you need to scrub out and look at certain keyword searches, you can do that today. There's apps that do this sort of thing. And you're going to start to evolve to continuous monitoring and deep learning. As I talked about earlier, you're going to build a model, a data model on how your company runs. What's normal, what's not. And as auditors, you need to understand what that is. And the way you understand it is by scanning through it, by having things like deep learning and AI look through it, look for what's normal, what's not. And of course, your audits will help inform you on that. So you're going to evolve to this where, as I mentioned earlier, you want to know what to not audit as well. So if you find an area where it's not that critical, based on the amounts and based on how things are going, it's a useful tool to basically have a trigger in the system. Don't look at it until it tells you it needs looking at. All right. So I think those are very important ways that you can get started in this process. So I think we're going to turn it over to Deepjee, I believe, and continue the presentation.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you very much, Jeff. Having gone through the presentation, Jeff, it was presented in such a lucid and wonderful manner, and I think you covered the concepts and then went on to the case studies and the audit perspective, and then the RPA case study, two case studies on RPA, and then how it can be adopted by any internal audit uh, organization, internal audit team, whether it is in-house or whether it is outsourced internal auditing firm. What I'll do is I don't want to dive into my presentation now. After such a wonderful presentation, I don't want to repeat what has been said by you. So what I would do instead is I can just add from the Indian perspective, from India side, is that there has been a lot of the Indian internal auditor is no different from the internal auditor in North America, whether it is development work, whether it is adoption of new technology. So we have hundreds and hundreds of auditors, thousands and thousands of auditors, but hundreds and hundreds of organizations in this country now using different analytical tools, solutions, building RPA, using audit apps. So we have seen that happen in the last, and there's been an explosion in the last 3 or 5 years that we are seeing that happen across the country and in the neighboring countries. So what I will do is when you are incidentally, Jeffery Sorensen was here for the IDEA user conference in Feb 2020, just before the pandemic. So we had very good, useful interactions with number of chief internal auditors and partners from audit firms. When he was here, he also addressed a number of auditors in different forums like Bombay Chartered Account Society, IIA, etc. So what we did was immediately after he went back, we took all the material from Jeff, and with his permission, we put together an article on what he has shown today, analytics and artificial intelligence. And then we put an Indian case study. We have an Indian case study of RPA where an automobile major in the country has automated their accounts payable system, so using IDEA. So we took that as a base and we converted that into an article write-up, which was published as part of the Bombay Chartered Account Society. So we will send it out to all the article which is there, 4 pages of article which covers the talk which Jeff has given, plus the Indian case studies. We'll send it out to all the participants of today who have registered for the webinar today. That's the first thing. And second is, I can just share with all of you 1 or 2 case studies. One is when we go out to do an internal audit, maybe as an outsourced firm, or maybe as an in-house internal auditor, you have a quarterly audit, or you have quarterly cycles of different areas like procurement and inventory, and then you have sales, you have got payroll audit to be performed. What we find is that earlier we used to go out and do maybe the teams would lend up and then use their computers and then use Excel and then use Word and maybe fetch data and do audit. But nowadays what's happening is that you get access to the client system. Many of the clients are giving you access uh, remotely. So what happens is you get access to the client data. You can get whatever files, or you can request the files from the client. You need, of course, to look at the control totals. Very important, because you need to see that what data you got is the right data in the software with the client on the ERP. And then you actually run the tests. If it's a procurement area, then you actually run 30-35 tests on procurement, the basic tests which you need to perform when you're going there, or what you're doing there physically earlier. So you're talking about a data driven audit. So you run those tests, you get the exceptions, and then your team can land up in the field to do audit where you'll require some manual conversations, or you require to talk to people, or you require to visit some vendors, or you require to talk about cost reduction or something, some other area which is a value add. So basically you're already armed with a lot of deviations, or a lot of non-conformities before you have actually landed up at the client place. Now that saves a lot of time in terms of quality audit time, auditors time, because I think auditors are the raw metal. If you look at the number of auditors being auditing, that they are the raw metal for the firm or for the internal audit shop. So that saves a lot of time for the auditor, and of course it's more comprehensive, and you can take the entire universe, you can take the entire data set for 1 year or 2 years, rather than looking at only samples. So that makes it more comprehensive. So you have got better data, you have got to talk about with the auditing and with the management later on if there are findings to be flagged off. So that makes it, that is the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about, where we are actually employing it in the field as a consulting firm also, is that if you take an area like procurement or payroll, what we are doing is we are actually doing a continuous monitoring using the solution. So basically you run those tests every month on the SAP data or the Oracle database which the client has, and you build your tests, you run those tests where you find that there are errors, or the process is prone to errors, or those transactions are prone to error because those validations have not already been built into the ERP. So you can run those tests every month, every quarter at a set frequency, and make them available to the process owner and to the auditing team. So basically, you can actually track the non-conformities, or on a dashboard, and you can see whether they are going down or whether they're going up, and how corrective action is taken by the teams, by the process owners, by the teams, procurement teams, or by the respective process teams. So that has been successfully implemented in the field, and then maybe later on you can leave those tests with the process owners. So handing out the technology to the process owners so that they can employ those tools, they can look at the solution, run it themselves in finance, in procurement, in payroll, in travel, in expenditure areas by finance, etc. And maybe the auditors can move to the next level. So we're seeing that happen across the country with people. So employing analytics, employing artificial intelligence, machine learning, that's already started happening in a big way across the country, Jeff. So I think I don't want to take more time, because this has been a wonderful presentation. What I can say is, let us keep it open for questions, answers, because we have Jeffrey from Canada. He's got up early in the morning to talk to us. So uh, uh, I would rather have him speaking to all of us. So Jairam, if there are questions, if people can post their questions in the chat box, the best is that Jeff can answer those questions.
Sure, I am just getting the questions.
Right. That was very interesting, by the way, Deepjee, the Indian
Thank you.
perspective. I agree.
you.
I mean, we're all in the same boat. Like, we're all living with changes happening quickly. You saw that in the video, how companies are looking at, reinventing themselves, or they'll be out of business. Their competition
Absolutely.
is stiff, right? and they're all looking at how do we maintain, the returns we're getting, and everyone else is automating. So they're finding ways
Absolutely.
to get the same or more out of what they have today, and it is possible. As Deepjee was saying, there are tools and techniques and automation and apps that are available right now. So I would definitely suggest play around.
I think, Jeff, I think what is important is, as you rightly said in your presentation, imagination is the key. How to employ and what to employ. What are you currently doing, and how that can be automated or analytical tools can be used in the process that we are currently employing in our process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I take up some of the questions which have been posted
Please,
to the question
please,
box?
please,
Wonderful.
please.
So there's a question from Mr. Satish Shenoy. Why is it that HR is predicted to be the least use of AI? And Mr. Shenoy is referring to the slide on projections, Jeff, from your
Right.
slide deck.
Yeah, in fact, that slide, I was debating whether to keep it. I think it's old, honestly. They even have things like agriculture being very low, which I don't agree with at all. I think agriculture is going to explode when it comes to uh, robotics and picking, because it's a job that is, um, very difficult to find people. There's lots of labor problems. Costs are always an issue. So I agree. I think that slide, I think I might just take it out, honestly, because it's old. Because areas like HR are definitely going to look at AI. It only makes sense. So I actually agree with you there. I think I should remove that slide, because I always found it was a little old. And they always talk about marketing being everything with AI, but there's so many industries, even in the video you saw, making T-shirts. Well, now the materials can move themselves through the process, and they can align themselves and stitch themselves and move through the whole system without anyone touching it. I mean, that's huge, right? There's machine vision for that. There's all kinds of AI for that. So yeah, I think I'll take that out. But it's a good comment.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, there's a question from Mr. Sushil Padhi, but I believe he has left, but I'm sure this question will benefit everyone. He's sent his appreciations for the session, and he's very specifically said, in risk management, if we use machine learning, I believe we should use regression, uh, linear for scoring and logistic for labeling, that is the K-test. So his question is, which model should we use uh, considering large size databases? And so his point essentially is, which ML model can be used in risk management, I think. Yeah.
You're right. Okay, that's a tricky question. Because I've worked on the Outliers app that we have, one of the free apps when you buy Idea that you can download. And the truth is, there's no one model that really serves all cases. It very much depends on the nature of the data. Because I found sometimes there's certain regression algorithms were very good at certain types of data. For instance, if you're looking at a master file, customer master file, I thought SVM was a kernel or an approach that worked very well. But then if you have very financial oriented data, other ones were better. So I wish there was a simple answer to that. I think what will happen is, over time, with more and more experience in these fields, I think we will start to figure out the kinds of algorithms and classifiers that work with certain kinds of data. So I think that knowledge is going to evolve, but I don't think there is a one size fits all, unfortunately, for data. It really just depends on the volume of transactions, the nature of the data. It really does vary a lot.
Jeff, thank you. Jeff, a couple of more questions. There's a question from Mr. Santosh Purohit. His question is whether RPA plus AI technology, can the auditor eliminate, when using RPA plus AI technology, pardon me, can the auditor eliminate surprises considering regulatory perceptions on auditors' roles?
Can they eliminate surprises? I think that's one of the key objectives of analytics in general, is that we want to we want to model the business. We want to understand what is normal for the business and what is not normal, what is out of the norm, what is an outlier, what is fraud, what is errors. And you want to use for data analytics. And one thing I didn't mention in this presentation, which is actually a growing field, is that companies are increasingly looking at outside data. They're looking at external data, benchmarking. They're looking at trends for the same industry as the company, and they're comparing them to what we see. So take macro level data and comparing them to trends that we have in our own data, and try to see if it matches. Why are we? And if you look at frauds like Enron as an example, they were completely bucking all industry trends of the whole industry. They were just going up, up, up. But the whole industry as a whole was going through a very different phase. Well, you could look at that to say, that's odd. Why are we so different than the whole rest of the industry that we're in? Can that really be right? And they can talk about how wonderful their process is, but is that really right? Are we really so having that ability to challenge and to determine, look at surprises, get the surprises, or you're getting the surprises early. That's what you're doing, right? You're not eliminating the surprises, you're exposing what's in the data. So definitely analytics, and you talk about RPA, why not? RPA just makes that more painless. You put less effort into arriving at the result you would get anyway. So it is about, but I think fundamentally, think of it as a business model. You're trying to decide what is normal for my business. What's a typical transaction? What is the breakdown? Small, medium, large transactions. Who are the clients we tend to have? And that data should reveal something which is true to the company, right? Sometimes people don't know what companies they're running. They find that they think they're in business A, but when you look at the data, they're really not winning the way they think they're winning. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, a very popular question from Mr. Raj Srivastava. I'm sure a lot of folks would have this question. Would there be a time where AI stroke automation would replace auditors?
I would say replace a good auditor? No, I don't think so. And the reason why is I said it a little bit earlier, but you can't make a computer accountable or responsible for the work. In the end, you can't, right? It's to say it was all the computer did it. I didn't do anything. I mean that someone has to own that risk. Someone has to own that audit. I do think good auditors will also recognize that computers and AI is not infallible. I mean, you can see the things that can go really, really wrong with technology if it goes slightly off. Because remember, the technology isn't intelligent, really. Like it's not a sentient being that understands right from wrong and knows what it does. It has instructions. They may be very advanced instructions. They may be based on 10 years of data, but it just marches along. I actually have a video that I didn't show you, but I did it for the ACFE last year. And it was about, if you guys have those little home speakers, I have one of those Google Home, the Alexa, Amazon, they have their own, right? But I asked it once because they can play music. So I asked it once to play funk music. So funk is like, that kind of a jazzy, weird kind of style, right? And sometimes it's just fun to listen to, right? So I would ask Google to play some funk music, and I tend to get very weird results. And the results got stranger and stranger. I got German rap. After a while, I got weird noises. I got radio theater plays, people talking, blah, 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 random. It was very odd. But if you ask the same box, play me jazz, you would get perfect. You would always get jazz, many different kinds of jazz. So it's one of those things where, because no one had thought of auditing or checking to see if Google's actually giving the right results. Like there's been no auditor determining whether funk music was correctly identified by Google. That's not in the system. Now, you're not going to listen to funk music at work, but you're going to have the same problems with AI at work that everyone's assuming it's doing the right thing, but has anyone tested it? Has anyone validated those models are in fact based on data we want to train it with, number one? And does it work the way it intends to? Because I have to say, within AI, because we're not hard coding those paths anymore, we're letting the data train itself, we don't 100% know why it's doing what it's doing, which sounds crazy, but it's a fact about AI now, is that those neural networks are getting so complicated that we don't really know how they work. We do know that if we feed it the right types of data, it tends to give us the right results. But how does it arrive at that? We don't really know. And so we need to invest a lot more. So now the bad auditors, if an auditor doesn't keep up, doesn't attend training sessions, doesn't try to learn about AI, doesn't care that the company is going in a direction which could be very risky, if they don't figure out how they can audit the AI, those auditors may find themselves out of a job. But any good auditor, any auditor who's on top of this, and I have to say one thing, as auditors, you can't just sit and wait for management to pick your number and wait for them to see your hand up. You will have to walk in to boardrooms. Your chief auditors will have to make room for audit at the table. They will have to say, you're doing this, okay, we're creating an audit on this very technology. You're going to, use it for voice print, whatever, fine, we're going to audit that. We're going to in and see if it works the way it does. You're using this new third-party supplier that's going to give you this thing, we're going to audit them. Like audit needs to really, in some ways, push their way in and make themselves valuable. If you just sit back and wait for someone to invite you to the dance, you'll sit on the chair all night. You do have to be assertive. So I would say good auditors will always keep their job, always. I would say the ones who are not investing in themselves and are just thinking everything is the way it was 20 years ago, they're going to find themselves pushed out. That's my opinion.
Jeff. Jeff, a couple of more questions, I think, as we go ahead. There's a question from Mr. Anand Sharma, where he checks, is there any specific AI tool for the IT industry which is very popular and like a de facto standard for the IT industry?
I mean, there are many tools out there. I would say what we have tried as a company, Caseware Idea, is we try to build things that auditors will use. There are lots of tools for AI. I do find many of them are needlessly complicated. They're very math oriented. They are very programming oriented. That if you know how to script and program and you understand the math, you can do all kinds of things, right? But I do find what auditors are really looking for is something that works with how they operate. So in other words, give me audit data analytics, and I also want to check for AI. Perfect. That tends to work better than just saying, oh, download Python and have fun. That tends to not work very well in the real world. So I would say start with SAMA audit. Just say, look, I'm looking at doing these things. What have you got? What's out there that I can use today? And start there. And then that would, to me, from an auditor's perspective, if we're dealing with mathematics students, different story. They would want to go in and go crazy. But I find most auditors don't have the time. Like they have other things to do than learn everything about math. So that's my perspective.
Thank you, Jeff. I think Mr. Vinayak's question on AI impact on humans and auditors has already been very nicely articulated by you. We've got a question from Mr. Satish Shenoy. Jeff, do you see the audit of supply chain being done differently using AI than how it is traditionally being done till date?
Well, supply chains are going to change, right, over the next probably decade. You saw this whole thing about printing. Now, about printing metal parts and printing body parts. I mean, we're able to print a lot of things. They're still a bit slow, but this idea that we can create parts where the manufacturing is happening is going to really revolutionize our industry. So now, as far as using AI to audit those, again, sometimes auditors don't have access to all of those back-end systems. But audit does need to find a way to understand and get data out of all these very complex supply chains to be able to know that things are actually being performed the way they're supposed to. It can be a challenge to get into those systems, to be honest, those just-in-time inventory systems. But we'll have to see how this whole 3D printing will change the industry. Are some supply chains going to drastically change as a result? Maybe they'll become simplified. We really will have to see. But what is true, though, is depending on the size of your company and the business you're in, you're going to see huge volumes of data, huge volumes of data. And you could use AI to help sort out what's relevant from what's not relevant. Because when you have such enormous data volumes, you probably will employ AI, maybe some deep learning, to try to determine, again, it goes back to the point I made earlier, what's normal, what's not normal, right? And be able to tell, be able to learn that about a business so that you can focus on where things are risk. Really, you're really trying to focus on the highest risk. And with such data volumes and complexities, you probably will end up using AI to do it with. I don't think it's mandatory necessarily, but it's just that with the volumes you're getting and the complexities, AI can definitely be a big help.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, a question for Mr. Kashyap Vaidya. ML is a subset of AI. Can you elaborate in terms of the role of internal audit in RPI AI ML, as IA is now more of a logical thinking and intelligent probing function?
Okay, I'll try to answer that question. I mean, when you distill what we call AI, really, it is automation partly, and it's a lot of statistics, really. That's when you peel all the layers away, it is really about statistical models. So I have some data. What is standard deviation? How far are you deviating from the standard? Are you an inlier? Are you an outlier? That's kind of what it comes down to in the end. So as auditors, we're going to try to leverage whatever tricks, whatever tools, whatever whatever turbocharge we can bring into our profession, we're going to leverage. And if sometimes RPA, it's somewhat dumb automation, but if that can help us on our path, we'll use it. If regression analysis is good for us and we can determine the trend of a particular function, we can use that, that's great. AI is really just built on layers and layers of that, right? So they've taken essentially, regression analysis, which is stats, and they've built, layers and layers of that on top of each other with a bit of smart automation and so forth. And they've created something much bigger out of it. So we can choose and we can jump into this anywhere we want. We can go with the full deep learning model. That's great. We can also just do some little regression analysis. There's nothing wrong with that. Regression analysis should be a tool of any auditor. Benford's law, things like that, right? That are just math functions. That the key thing about auditing, and there's a mentor of mine a long time ago. He said we were implementing a new system at the time. And he was telling his the new users, and he was a British guy, and he was always a little bit brutal. I don't know, like a little bit rough around the edges. But he would say things like, "If you don't know how to audit, this system won't help you." So these are things he would say, but he was right in the sense that a fool with the tool is still a fool. You have to know auditing. You have to understand the business you're auditing. And then the tools are very helpful. But if you really don't understand the business you're auditing, the tools themselves are not going to save the day. You don't know what you're dealing with. You don't understand what you're seeing. Because you can perform great audit work with very simple tools if you really understand the business, right? So tools can help us understand what's going on in the business, but you still need to have that analytical mindset. You still need to be curious. You still need to be that imagination that Deepjee talked about. Absolutely critical. If you can't imagine what and see what the business ought to be like, and to recognize when something is not right. How can you audit? You may have findings right in front of you, and you may not recognize that they're findings. So I don't know. Hopefully, I answered your question.
Perfect, Jeff. Jeff, couple of more questions. I'll try to speed it up. A question from Jaiprakash Sen. How do we measure, test, manage AI bias with regard to training modules used in machine learning?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, but it's going to be huge. Auditors will need to look at bias. I think because the AI models themselves don't have this if then else logic that you can just look at. Our AI systems are going to have to reverse engineer that. And over time, you will see vendors do that, where they're going to say, and we actually do it to some degree with our Outliers plugin for IDEA. We have a field called reason code, and reason code tells you why something was an outlier. So we have a famous example that we use where we're looking at payroll data. In one particular transaction, this employee is from Mexico, but they're paid, the currency says China. So it was just a data entry error, but AI will pick that up. It will actually look at this to say, this is not normal. I think we have a problem. So I think, in other words, we have to leverage these tools where we can. And let me just hear more of the question. I want to make sure I answer the rest of the question. So Jairam, could you just mention the rest of the question again?
Sure. The question is, how with regard to training modules for machine learning, how do we measure, test, manage
The
AI
bias,
bias?
right. Got it,
Yeah.
Yes. So a lot of it, because we can't see inside the systems, we're going to have to do a lot of testing. And I think we're going to have to understand the variables. So let's say that credit example, right? With the Apple credit card, where the two people get different credit limits. I think we're going to have to basically pump a lot of data at it and look at the results that come out. And we're going to have to identify common errors or errors in the model which would be problematic today. So in other words, if our historical data tends to be very sexist or racist or disadvantage certain people, we know today what those are, those trigger points, and we're going to have to build test plans that push those buttons and see what the results are going to be. And right now, that's probably the only way we really can do it. Eventually, the AI technology itself will be able to expose the model and be more self-describing, but they're not very good today. So I think right now, what I would recommend audit do is to look for bias. Is you should probably get the same AI in a training, in a non-production environment, and if they can create their own test data that hits those pressure points and just feed it the transactions and then see if they align with the expectation that came out. That's probably the way I would do it today. But it's a fascinating field, and auditors are going to have to become auditors of bias and ethics and so forth. You're hearing ethical audits are now starting to happen. These are our history, because it's in data. We're going to start to reveal these biases over time, and it's a fascinating field as auditors. But I would try to invest in that as an auditor. I would learn about that, study this, but that's, I think, just having a test environment and create test data and look at results. That would be my first step. But do more research on the field by all means, because it'll be important. Auditors will all need to do this because it's going to drive poor business decisions, right?
Jeff, an important question from Mr. Santosh Purohit. From an organization perspective, what is the tenure of ROI considering an initial investment on an RPA AI technology combination for a medium-sized business?
Okay, I won't be able to give you what the ROI is going to be for that. I mean, I think there are probably RPA vendors that do this sort of thing. I would, when it comes to RPA, it depends on who's implementing this. I mean, we're dealing with internal audit today, And if internal audit is performing its own RPA, then I think it makes sense to get something where you also get a data analytics tool as part of the bargain. That just only makes sense to do, because audit will be able to use it in two ways. Now, if this is the organization themselves that are trying to automate a function, you are more successful. Remember that chart I showed you earlier where there was a top part of the chart, which is automate the whole thing if you can. And then at the other end is this is impossible to automate. And RPA is sort of in the middle of that. If you could stay out of the middle as much as possible, just automate the function. Like if you can, because if it belongs to the business and it's something that they do all the time, that's probably your best bet. That is where everything end to end is automated and you don't need to use RPA in the normal way. The process just works better. If that's impossible to do, be aware that RPA just has to be very clearly defined, and should be and the return on investment. I mean, you should get that money back fairly quickly. If this is going to take 10 years, it's not the right case. It's one of those where the automation is not worth your time. So I can't give you a specific number, but I would say RPA benefits should be very obvious, or you shouldn't do it. That's my perspective.
Thanks, Jeff. We've got some interesting statements from Mr. Shenoy, which I will pass on to you offline. One of them is a
Sure.
fool with a tool is still a fool. Uh, so I think that's a message which you were kind of passing on in one of your slides. And a final question, I think, Jeff, which is a two-parter to an earlier question on testing AI,
Right.
again for Mr. Sen. Should this testing be done by an auditor or a
So
by
you
an
cut
auditor
out
or a programmer?
or
Should the
programmer.
testing be
Okay.
done by an auditor or a programmer?
Right. Um, well, I sort of was both. My career, I was an IT auditor, so I am a programmer. I can write Python code, but I can also write audit scripting. I think you're going to need both. You're going to need someone who can automate this function a bit. So, for instance, if we're writing a test file that has X number of cases that pushes X number of buttons, you're going to need someone with a little bit of computer skills to build that test data. You're also going to need the subject matter experts who understands more what these buttons are, because programmers are not always the best people to know the business. They'll understand it, but sometimes having a person, subject matter expert who understands the field they're in, will know what those buttons are. They're going to say, oh, if you, in each case is going to be different what those sensitive matters are. But I think you really need the integrated approach. You need someone who understands the hot button areas, and someone needs to kind of operationalize it. So that would be my suggestion. If they're both the same person, wonderful. They're often not, and it's okay to have a team up, to have two people involved. You're spreading the knowledge around. It's a good thing. You can't always expect one person to do everything. A team approach is typically the better.
That was the last question, Jeff. So
Hmm.
back over to Deepjee sir and Chanchal Mishra. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I think I'll over to Chanchal, please. I think wonderful session, good, and thank you, Jairam, for handling the questions. So, Chanchal.
Yeah, thank you everyone, sir, and thanks Jeff sir, Deepjee sir, Jairam sir. I'm requesting participants to answer some feedback question. So I'm just launching the poll. Deepjee sir, you can give vote of thanks if we can close down after that.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot to Institute of Internal Orders India Bombay chapter, to the President Akhilesh Thakur, and to all the other Board of Governors, also to IA India functionaries, and also a very extend a very big thank you to Jeffery Sorensen, especially since he's out of his busy schedule. He's been able to accommodate us in India and got up early in the morning, to make this presentation to us. That is why we had this time of 6 to 8 p.m. Thanks, Jairam, for handling the questions. And thank you very much. A very big thank you to all the participants for logging in and being with us for Jeffery Sorensen's presentation. Thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Yes, that's great. Thank
So
you very much.
we are logging off.
Yeah.